Welcome back, you brave souls. So we're going to start, as we did with the first 2 weeks, with prayer. We're going to sing the same prayer as last time. Holy wisdom, lamp of learning, bless the light that reason lends. Teach us judgment as we kindle sparks of thought your Spirit sends. Sanctify our search for knowledge and the truth that sets us free. Come illumine mind and spirit, joined in deepest unity. Vine of truth, in you we flourish, by your grace we learn and grow. May the word of Christ among us shape our life, our search to know. Joined to Christ in living, dying, may we help the church convey witness to the saving gospel, bearing fruit of faith today. Excuse me. I was joking last week with those of you who were here that I was apologizing that the first 2 sessions didn't have enough content. And as a matter of fact, there was a lot of content. So we're going to shift gears just a little bit in terms of format and methodology tonight. Hopefully, talking about religious truth, we will do this in a way that's accessible to our experience. So here's what I'm proposing as our method today. First of all, we'll start with small group conversation. If I had your email, I sent you an invitation to think about a religious or spiritual experience and then to come prepared to talk about it. I gave you some questions, which I'll put up there in a little bit, saying that no one will be forced to say anything. Don't worry about saying something that sounds odd or weird, because sometimes religious experiences can sound that way. But I'm hoping that what we could do is prime the pump by just getting some conversation going at the table. So I'll give you some ground rules. And then after there's been conversation at the tables, then my presentation is going to be a story that's my religious experience, okay, one of my religious experiences. And then I hope to do an in-depth unpacking of the story that I tell as a way of illustrating some of the principles and tools for understanding and judging the truth of a religious experience. Then we'll do small group conversation and closing prayer. So that's the plan on paper. We'll see how it works. Okay? So the first thing I'm going to invite you to do is to share and unpack your stories. I'm guessing that there won't be time for everyone at the table to share and unpack their story. That would probably take the whole hour and a half. So you can decide how you want to do that. What I request is that everybody respect the other person's experience. Not to make judgments about it, but to just try to listen and understand what's being said, as well as the judgments that are made about that experience. People need to feel free, because there's a good possibility there's going to be sharing some vulnerabilities. So then after you share the experience, and these things, the questions that I posed, have to do with some of the criteria for truth that we identified last week. I just put them in plain English this week. Okay? So what was I feeling during and after the experience? What, if anything, in my previous life experience prepared or predisposed me for this experience? What stood out as symbolic in the experience? Something that caught my attention and drew me in. It doesn't have to be a churchy symbol. It could just be something that reached out and grabbed your attention. And what did I take that symbolic experience to mean? What was I intending before, during, and after the experience? And what, if any, difference did the experience make in me and my life going forward? You don't have to address every one of those questions. Those aren't, those are intended to be guide questions. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and those of you who have prepared and would like to share, feel free with the caveats that I offered. Okay? Have at it. I'm going to give you a little more time than usual for this small conversation. I'm just curious. Show of hands, how many thought this was an easy exercise? How many thought it wasn't easy? Yes, I'm just curious. I'm guessing that telling the story was easier than answering the questions. Okay. So I'm going to make an attempt to tell a story and then answer some of those questions more or less. The experience that I'm going to share happened in September of 2016, and it spanned a weekend. It went from a Friday to the following Monday. And in order to get this started, I have to share with you a couple of scriptures because the Monday portion happened at Mass, and I want to share the readings with you, and why I'm doing this will be obvious when we get further into the story. So the first reading was from Proverbs, and it said, "Refuse no one the good on which he has a claim, when it is your power to do it for him. Say not to your neighbor, go and come again, tomorrow I will give, when you can give at once." Okay, so that was the first reading that day. The gospel was, excuse me, from Luke. "No one who lights a lamp conceals it with a vessel or sets it under a bed. Rather, he places it on a lampstand, so that those who enter may see the light. For there is nothing hidden that will not become visible, and nothing secret that will not be known and come to light. Take care then how you hear. To anyone who has, more will be given, and from the one who has not, even what he seems to have will be taken away." Okay, we'll come back to those a little later, but those were the scriptures for Monday, September 19th, 2016. So here's how the story begins. I'm sharing this with the people at Mass. Last Friday, I had a parlor service for Jackie, a woman with whom I went to grade school. I hadn't seen Jackie since the day we walked out of the grade school building, so I met with her husband Dave the day before to fill in some of the huge gap in my experience of her. And by the way, the service was at my family funeral home in Slavic Village. Okay. That'll be important. Dave, her husband, described Jackie as a good person. He was her second husband. She was divorced, had a daughter, Dawn, by a previous marriage, was always there for you, never raised her hand against anyone, was a nurse at St. Alexis Hospital for many years, not much of a churchgoer in recent years, chose not to do dialysis at the end. What kind of life would that have been? So that's the background that Dave gave me. So with this background in mind, I chose the reading from Matthew 25:31 to 46 for the service. That's the judgment scene where Jesus comes and says, "When I was hungry, you gave me food, thirsty, you gave me drink." I pointed out that the criteria for judgment in that story was not ostensible and official religious practice, for example, the Mass, the Rosary, or Novena, but how we treat each other, especially how we treat the least among us. By this criteria, I suggested Jackie was among those who were blessed. It also made reference to how the text reminds us that we are caught up in something bigger than ourselves, something we don't always recognize at the time. When did we see you hungry and give you food? Okay? Didn't necessarily realize that at the time. And Dave had mentioned such experience, caught up in something bigger. He said his mother died on Mother's Day, and later his father died on Father's Day. And he talked about his experience of being at Jackie's bedside when she died. So after the service, I went to my car, which was parked on the newly renovated Fleet Avenue in front of the funeral home parking lot, turned it on, buckled my seatbelt. Then I waited for the casket to be brought out and the funeral procession to assemble. I was wearing my Roman collar. As I sat there waiting and watching, with the radio on in the background, I looked around at the newly renovated street, with memories and hopes of the neighborhood flitting in and out. And for some reason, perhaps because of the Matthew text, perhaps not, I remembered not giving money to a repeat requester, and even more, giving not only money but also a hard time to him the last time I gave him money. As I sat with my mind wandering, I noticed a man walking on the sidewalk toward the car. He was in his late 40s, early 50s, burly and heavily tattooed. He seemed to be walking with purpose. But as he walked by, he caught sight of me sitting in the car. He passed the car, walked around it, and came and knocked on my window. I lowered it. He said, "Father, I'm from Conneaut, and I need $14 for the rest of my bus fare to get home. Can you help me?" I asked him his name. He said it was Tim. And I thought, can I be more of a captive audience? Belted into my car, wearing my Roman collar. This guy has nailed me. So I reached into my pocket and gave him 20 bucks. Then after he left, I remembered again the text of Matthew 25. And then I thought, not only has this guy nailed me, but God now is nailing me. So then I'm going to how I work this into the homily. This gives me some insight into what today's gospel is talking about. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a bushel basket, but on a lampstand where it gives light to all, where everything becomes visible. I had preached on the text of Matthew in order to shine a light on Jackie's life and the experience of her life for those who knew and loved her. But that light also shone on me as I sat in the car and interacted with Tim. And I felt what Jesus meant when he said, "Take care what you hear." And once in the light, I, who had an experience of the light relative to Jackie, was given even more in the sharing. I was drawn more deeply into the many layers of meaning and significance of the brief interaction with Tim. So perhaps what is given is light, and the more is what is seen, encountered, accepted, or resisted in the light. The more that is given in the light might not always be pleasant or easy, but it's more. Okay, so that's my experience. Now I'd like to take some time to unpack that experience, and every now and then I will come back and make some explicit reference to it. I didn't want to go there yet. Our world, and I mentioned this last week, our world as we experience it, including our experience of the divine, and my experience in this story, is thoroughly shaped by symbols. Without symbols, we would just be creatures buffeted by the countless stimuli that bounce off all of us at the time. Remember last week I talked about the biological component that we bring to religious experience. Therefore, as we heard last week, we are interpreting animals who must assess the truth of the interpretations we make about our engagement with reality, including our engagement with the divine. It's not good enough just to interpret. We have to assess the truth. And that's not an easy thing. Okay? We might feel something, you might be convinced of something, but we could be off the mark. Everything can serve as a sign or symbol through which we experience our world. And among the many signs available to us, we choose some from among them to construct a worldview. Okay? So what's a worldview? A worldview is a set of signs more or less coherent by which individuals who hold the worldview are oriented to the things in the various domains with which they directly and indirectly interact. So this is an example. Okay, you can see that set of signs that is there. They're all traffic signs, but they create a worldview for us when we're driving on the street or walking on the street. So they're more or less coherent, but they orient us to the various things in the domains in which we interact directly or indirectly. So as we're driving, whatever we're thinking about, listening to the radio, or whatever, we see those signs and we get an orientation about how to behave in our car. Okay? A subset of our worldview is what Neville calls, borrowing from Peter Berger, a sacred canopy. A sacred canopy orders us to ultimates, to the divine, to the outermost elements of the symbolized world. It may include symbols that are religious, but symbols may be religious and not a formal part of any religion. That's important to note. It doesn't have to be a Catholic symbol, doesn't even have to be a Buddhist symbol. It could be something that takes on the quality of something that orients us to the ultimate, to the divine. I mentioned that the worldview and the sacred canopies are all part of a culture that is shaped by 21st century American culture. It shapes the symbols to which we have access and influences those which become a part of our worldview and our sacred canopy. We might not always be aware of how that culture is shaping our attention and pointing us in directions, but it does. And it's worth noticing what some of those are. So faith and culture, some determinants of, I'm just going to go through these real fast and name them. Determinants of North American culture. The digital age and digital device. We talked about that a lot during the first session. Globalization and resistances to it. Secularization. People don't seem as explicitly religious anymore. Religious pluralism. We're not just the only religion in town anymore, but we interact with all kinds of other religions, either directly or indirectly. Fundamentalisms. Scientific worldviews, which can often be directly at odds with religious worldviews. I subscribe to Scientific American, and there is an organization that explicitly tries to draw people away from religion to adopt what they call a scientific worldview. The new atheism, consumerism, ethnicities, class differences, individualism, feminism, diversity, change as a constant, etc., etc., etc. Contemporary culture is exceedingly complex, and if we think of it as kind of a top-down thing, we live in a culture provides us with symbols that shape our worldview, and then there's a subculture of that worldview which is a sacred canopy, which orients us toward the ultimate or to the sacred. So, thinking of my story, what were some of the determinants that were shaping my experience? I'd say all of the above, but in particular, diversity. Tim was different than I. Class differences. We were certainly in different socioeconomic backgrounds. Catholic Christianity, I just heard those scriptures and was sitting there thinking, oh, thank you, God, for talking to me. And Scripture. Okay, so those were some of the things in the sacred canopy under which I dwelt that shaped me to enter that experience in the way that I entered that experience. Making sense so far? Okay. So let's take I've done this in some other presentations, so some of this might be review for some of you. So I want to talk about some important considerations about how symbols work and what's involved in interpreting and the assessment of the truth of what we interpret. And how symbols help us engage the real, and in particular the divine. So I mentioned this last week briefly, there are two different kinds of symbols. I'm drawing on Robert Cummings Neville again. He calls one extensional. The extensional dimension has to do with how symbols are related to other symbols in the worldview, the sacred canopy, and the immediate context. It's not how they relate to the real, it's how they relate to each other. And the connections to other symbols can be numerous and varied, and the connections help to determine the range of meanings a particular symbol can have. So symbols and their extensional meanings are neither true nor false. The truth or falsity of a symbol and its meaning comes up when the interpreter selects it and uses it to engage a reality, whether it's a divine reality or not. It is the truth of the engagement which is important for our purposes. Is the engagement with the divine made through the use of this symbol, in fact, a true engagement? Or am I imagining something that's not true or that's off the mark? So the extensional meanings of symbols are another way of looking at the font of possible meanings that we can attribute to what it is that we're interpreting in our experience. Then there are symbolic actions which are what he calls intentional. I take one of these symbols or more from the various range of possibilities in the extensional network, and I choose to engage the reality through this particular symbol, or this particular couple or three symbols. Okay? And this is important. When choosing a particular symbol, the interpreter brings into experience not just the meaning of the single symbol, but the whole range of meanings that are derived from the connection of the symbol with all the other symbols in the extensional dimension. So there might be one meaning that is prominent or dominant, but there are others that come along with it. And one of the examples that I like to use is, I think I used this last week too. Let's take the symbol of dog. Okay? But connected with the symbol of dog is canine, mutt, puppy, furry, one who bites, dog houses, pet, etc. So I might choose the symbol of dog through which to engage this experience in my worldview. But when I pick dog, all those other things come along, whether I'm aware of that or not. Okay? One is prominent and perhaps is the controlling or cohering symbol, but they all come along. And so things are, when we consider that, and the other thing is, we can take an intentional symbol, and then perhaps we're going to have two intentional symbols, and we place them one on top of the other with all their extensional meanings. And then maybe there's a third, and then with their extensional meanings. So the active interpretation can become exceedingly complex, which is why we have to wrestle with them and try to interpret and understand what it is we're meaning when we're putting symbols into play. I didn't want to go there yet. There are factors which influence the choice of symbols that we use intentionally. One is the situation or the context in which the interpreter is located. And in my case, I'm sitting in a car on Fleet Avenue, belted with my seatbelt on. The symbols that are available to the interpreter, the purposes or motivation that the interpreter brings, and the developmental stage at which the interpreter is located, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. So, if I look at my story, these are some of the extensional symbols that I identified. The poor person. When I think of poor person, there's a whole lot of other symbols that are connected with it extensionally. The scammer. Okay? Poor person and scammer layered one upon the other, a whole set of meanings that come along with that. the story of the final judgment in Matthew 25. In the homily, the image of light, the representative of the church. Okay, I'm sitting in the car with my Roman collar on. God as a surpriser. All of those, as I look back on this religious experience coming up on 9 years ago, were symbols that captured my attention, that drew me in, and that bounced off of one another, that shaped my experience of what was happening as I was sitting in that car on Fleet Avenue. What was my motivation? I was motivated by a desire for consistency and integrity. And that was not easy. I wanted to be consistent with what I was teaching and saying at the prayer service, and I wanted to do so with integrity, and so there was a temptation to move in a different direction at the time. The desire to do the right thing for the right reasons. That was part of the motivation for how I interpreted the experience. Developmentally, was I developmentally ready to engage? Well, for better or for worse, I was well educated theologically and ministerially experienced. That was a blessing and a curse in the experience, but not yet fully formed. So you can see how all these things that I'm talking about with symbols and how they work and what conditions our selection of symbols and how we interpret them, all those were at play, not immediately. Some of them were, but as I unpacked this, some of those other things came into view. So at this stage, we are still at the level of interpreting the meaning of the experience as recounted in the story. We need now to move from the question of meaning to the question of truth of symbol as symbolic engagement. But before we can do that, there are a few points which we must first consider about what Neville calls symbolic reference. This analysis presumes that there is a real which the symbol engages. And this is particularly important when we're talking about religious experience. It presumes that the symbols that engage what is shaping our experience, there is a real religious reality that is at play here. He identifies three kinds of reference. One is iconic, Iconic reference is something that says the symbol is like that to which it is referring. Okay, so a map is a symbol of the city. It's like that city that it's referring to. It's not exactly like it, but it's like it enough so that if I see the map, I'm going to recognize the city, or maybe vice versa. Okay? Let's go to the next one. Indexical. An indexical symbol is one that points to the reality that is being interpreted. It captures our attention. That's why I phrased it before. What in your experience captured your attention and drew you in, and becomes a stimulus to go further into it. Then there is conventional reference. That has to do, it's very much like the extensional that I was talking about. Most symbols refer in all three of these senses, but particularly important for religious symbols is that indexical reference has a kind of primacy, precisely because of the nature of religious reality. It's not always obvious, it's not always visual, we can't always feel it, we might sense it in some way, but it's not the same thing as those stop signs that we saw in extensional reference. So we need something in the religious to pull us. And he says, often religious symbols do not refer in a way that is iconically accurate or on target. We might come to the conclusion that God is talking to me or addressing me. It doesn't look anything like I would imagine God to be looking like, or the kind of God that I've been taught about. key consideration is whether or not the indexical reference does in fact engage the ultimate reality that we call God. And then there's something that, in interpretation, that Neville calls respect. In what respect do I interpret this symbol? So I put this up here. People might say, God is my rock. Is this the rock that we're talking about? Is it a rock that can be thrown at someone? Is it a rock that can build a house? So if I say God is my rock, in what respect am I using that symbol? Okay? So now all of the pieces are nearly in place to assess the important question of the truth of a symbolic engagement. Are they what the participant in the story claims them to be? But just a couple more preparatory comments. Attempting to assess the truth of a religious symbol or a religious experience is important because people act on them. And sometimes when they act on them, the action is good and helpful and holy. And sometimes if they get it wrong, harm comes from the interpretation that is given a religious significance. Without risking too much here, I think of some of the descriptions of Christian nationalists and how they act based on their assessment of the truth of their religious symbols, adopting attitudes and actions that I would consider to be foreign from what Christianity is all about. So it's important to assess the truth of a religious interpretation because people act on them. Great humility is required because our interpretation might be on target, but it might be flat wrong, or it might be skewed, or in need of refinement. And so Neville says we need to practice fallibilism. We need to presume that we don't get the whole thing right first time through, and maybe never. That our interpretations are always in need of refinement. And he says this, if we allow ourselves together to try to assess the truth of religious symbols, then perhaps over time we are going to gradually approach consensus on what is true about this particular religious experience, which is an argument for why what you did a little while ago, talking about your religious experience, sharing, making some claim as to what's true and why it's true, that's an important part of what it means to be growing in religious maturity. So now, truth in religious experience according to Neville. And this is, again, kind of a summary or a revisit of some of the things we said last week. There is a real that people engage symbolically. I mentioned that already. Truth is the carryover of value. I want to substitute that word I want to substitute real for value. Value is a very technical term in Neville's philosophical theology. So truth is the carryover of value in an object, in this case the religious object, into an interpreter as qualified by biology, culture, semiotics, and purposes of the interpreter. So as I unpacked my experience in 2016, biology factored in. I was strapped into my car. I was in listening to music. I was distracted by the changes that were taking place in the neighborhood. A lot of this stuff was just happening unconsciously, but that contributed to my experience. The culture, okay, that was at play. Symbols. A 40-something person, burly with tattoos, certainly had a symbolic significance to me. My Roman collar had a significance. and purposes. What was I doing there? Why was I doing that? All of that enters into how truth carried over the religious significance of that experience to me. The implication here is that the object, in this case I'm going to postulate the divine, causes the interpretation in the interpreter. When I described the story, I said not only did Tim nail me, God nailed me. God nailed me. God pushed the interpretation in that direction. So once every step has been taken to ensure that the interpretation of the experience has been accurate, then a truth claim can be assessed. This is pretty complicated. That's why I asked, is this easy or hard? I think relating the experience with an inward sense that this is a religiously significant experience is relatively easy, but assessing the truth of that experience, that's much more challenging, and we need each other to do that. Neville goes on to say that although the truth of teachings, doctrines, etc., can be subjected to other criteria such as coherence, consistency, etc., ultimately, for our purposes, criteria probably ought to be pragmatic. What effect does this engagement have on those engaged and upon the wider population with which they engage? Okay. And that is testimony to the truth or distortion of the truth or the flat-out inaccuracy of what's plain. It's kind of like, by their fruits you shall know them. And one of the things that Neville says that really captures my attention, he says, the real pushes back. The real pushes back, so that if we go in a wrong direction, or if we make a mistake, we won't be able to live there too long before we experience the real pushing back, and then we have to admit our fallibilism and do it some more. Does that make sense? So that's my experience, my religious experience. That's my attempt to unpack all that's involved, and it's not all that's involved, but some of the main things that's involved in religious interpretation, and why it's important to seek the truth of religious interpretations. So now I'm going to invite you to have small group conversations again. So what, if any, takeaways do you glean from our session tonight? Okay. What, if any, takeaways do you glean from our session tonight? And how, if at all, does this clarify or obscure the truth of your stories? Okay, why don't you take a moment of silence to just think about those, and then on my cue, I'll invite you to share at your table. So you don't necessarily have to take these questions in order. If one of them grabs you, talk about that one, but give it a shot. I know I'm springing this on you. So. Again, I want to thank you for your participation, your preparation, your willingness to make yourselves vulnerable in the sharing. All of that contributes to this being, I think, a significant religious experience. I'm not going to make any claims about specific kinds of truth, but I suspect that there was truth that was shared here today, and that's good. That's very good. We have one more session next week, and we'll look at some of the obstacles to pursuing truth. We looked at some of those in the first session, but I'll try to tease away some more. I invite you to stand for our closing. And remember, last week I told you that this part of the song that's in our hymnal comes from the Hindu scriptures, the Upanishads.
Interesting.
Lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth, from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Lead us from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace fill our hearts. Let peace fill our world. Let peace fill our universe. Lead us from death to life, from falsehood to truth, from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Lead us from hate to love, from war to peace. Let peace fill our hearts. Let peace fill our world. Let peace fill our universe. And may God lead us from here to home.